For those who have any doubts about where the science is, last November, actually it happened to be published one day after President Trump announced we were going to be pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. 4 colleagues and I published this paper. And at the time we published it, it's called The World Scientist Warning of a Climate Emergency. And we debated a long time. You hear a lot of talk about catastrophe and so forth, but emergency is what it is. An emergency means that that something terrible is happening and we need to respond to it. Whereas I think a catastrophe says it's kind of here and over. There's nothing we can do. So this has actually a hopeful dimension to it as well. There are things we can do to respond to a climate emergency. And we can reduce emissions from fossil fuels and other sources. And we can remove heat-trapping atmospheric carbon dioxide by increasing the removal of its removal by allowing existing trees to continue growing. And I'm going to frame the rest of this pretty much in those terms. Now you'll hear people say that well, forests can't do it all. Well, nothing can do it all. I mean, if we did everything we can with solar panels, that wouldn't do it all either. But it's interesting, it's underappreciated that growing more forests can do more, is doing more right now, and can do more in the future than any single action we can take. So we know that this is urgent and it's an emergency, and it's urgent that we react to it. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, at the request of governments, said that they would have to, they said, well, you know, governments have agreed we should keep the temperature from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And the question is, how do we do that? And so they said, well, to do it, we have to reduce the heat trapping gases by 45% from 2005 by 2030. That is the level it was in 2005. We have to be 45% below it. That means almost half. We have to cut in half what we were emitting just 15 years ago. By the way, half of all the carbon dioxide ever emitted, we have emitted since the early 1990s of the whole world. So we've got our work cut out for it. And we must not emit more than nature can remove by 2050 to halt future increases. Plants with carbon dioxide and water and the energy of the sun convert the carbon in the carbon dioxide into carbon in the wood and trees. And approximately half of the weight of dry wood is carbon. And what this will do is it will still increase global temperatures by about 1/3 more than they already are. We are at 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're supposed to keep it below 2.7. So our goal is to make things worse rather than better. So we need to do better than that, and we need action now. It's urgent. So here are just some facts about forest and climate. So fossil fuel combustion annually emits about 9.5 billion tons of carbon. That's almost incomprehensible, but that's a number. Just think 9.5. And 2/3 of that is carbon dioxide. Other gases also trap heat. Deforestation annually adds another 1.5 billion tons to the atmosphere. And that's just from the cutting down of trees. And we'll take a look at that again in a moment. But globally, forests annually remove from the atmosphere 1/3, 33% of the amount of emitted carbon from fossil fuel combustion. So imagine how much worse things would be if our forests had not been growing as they are. We would be in much worse shape because the heat trapping from those gases would be much greater. U.S. forests annually remove only 11.6% of our carbon emissions, which is low compared to this 33% for the world as a whole. And the reason for that, we know because there have been studies that show that just in 2018, a group in Germany led by Professor Erb found that altering forest management to let more trees grow would allow global forests to accumulate twice as much carbon as they are now doing. In other words, we have managed our forests, and you can see in this photo, there are a lot of little skinny trees in there, and there's only one big one. And in another study that was also done in 2018 by Lutz and his colleagues, this is a direct quotation from the paper, the largest 1% of trees in mature and older forests comprised 50% of forest biomass worldwide. What that means is out of every 100 trees, so just count the stems there, come up with 100 of them, and one of them, the biggest one, holds half the carbon. That means very clearly we need more big trees because that's where the carbon is stored. And we need more forests with more big trees in order to address the climate change at scale. And a paper just came out in September that finds that the potential for growing forests to accumulate carbon has been underestimated by about a third, 32%. So there's more to letting forests grow than we have thought in the past. Now we hear a lot of discussion about planting trees, and planting trees is good. There's no question about it. But letting them grow is better, and let me show you why. Last year in June, two colleagues and I published a paper about what it would mean to let more trees grow, and we realized that people talk about planting trees a lot, reforestation after we've cut down trees, afforestation when we plant them somewhere they haven't been growing, but there was no word for letting trees grow. So we searched around and we came up with the term proforestation, which means that we're going to let some of the trees grow. And so here's basically the definition of that. Growing forests to reach their potential for carbon accumulation in wood and soils in the absence of human interference. And one of the things about the Cook patent paper that I mentioned before is it demonstrates that in fact, letting forests grow in the absence of human interference does a better job than managed forests in terms of accumulating carbon. And so many people argue that, well, young trees are very efficient, they're growing really fast and so on, and yet they overlook a simple point, that if we let's say, even if that were true, and it isn't always true, they grow large and fast in a percentage basis, but they don't store much carbon. A little skinny tree like this one right here doesn't store much carbon compared to this one right here. And so cutting older trees and planting younger, fast-growing trees will not surpass the carbon accumulation by continuing to grow larger trees. This little tree has to grow to be as big as this tree to store as much carbon as that tree already has. So why would you cut that big one down to plant a little tree to grow faster? So I want to correct two false assumptions. Dana has mentioned both of them. Reverend Leo mentioned the bioenergy one, and the two statements that are made often by the forestry industry and by a lot of political figures is that burning wood for electricity, bioenergy, is carbon neutral, but it's not carbon neutral, and it's not even climate neutral, as I'll demonstrate in a moment. And burning wood products also produces these major health risks, as Reverend Leo pointed out. And the second false assumption is that carbon stored in wood products is a way to store carbon. That is, when you have a wood product that has wood and it has carbon in it, and that's stored. That's true. But I'll demonstrate in a moment that there's more carbon emitted in making that product than is stored in the product. And in a paper that was published last year by Mark Harmon, who's a very famous forestry expert out in Oregon, he estimates that the wood product benefits are often overestimated by factors of between 2 and 100 times. Back in 2010, a study was done by Nunnery and Keaton for all kinds of different harvesting. Each one of these bars represents everything on the left from clear cutting to the next to the last one on the right is an individual tree selection process. The light gray color is the amount that's stored in wood products. So from a clear cut there on the left, you can see roughly half of the carbon that was in the original forest, that's the height of the bar, is stored in that product. And then there's some left in the forest because they don't, when they clear cut, there's still a little bit left, so usually, not always. But there's a lot of dead wood. That's what the big bar at the bottom is, because there aren't many things left. And so that comes out to about 70 million grams of carbon per hectare. Well, just say 70. On the very far right, a forest with no management is storing not 70, but maybe 160 or 170. And almost all of it is in living trees. That's the dark bar at the bottom. And there's none stored in products. And that's what the forest looked like before it was cut. And that's what it's looking like at a point in time when it hasn't been cut. So where's the carbon from a harvested forest? What happens to it? And this graphic, this is research that was done by the U.S. Forest Service, by the way, finds that in the U.S., in the particular year that they chose to look at, which is sometime in the mid-20 teens, that U.S. forest harvesting yielded 162 million tons of carbon per year in that year. And I looked up on the U.S. inventory of emissions, and that's greater than all of the emissions from all the buildings in the United States, which is 149 million tons of carbon. And so when you look at all the emissions that come from forests, insect damage, fire, wind, drought, conversion, that's all adds up to 15%. And the emissions that come from the harvesting, because as you saw, at most half of the carbon that's there goes into the atmosphere, either by rotting left behind to rot and decay, or it goes to a mill and is burned for heat or electricity. Some colleagues and I out in the Pacific Northwest decided to take a look at a place that has really good data, which is the state of Oregon. We know exactly when the forestry industry began. It was in 1900, and there were data that ran through 2015 that we could look at. And we said, where is the carbon that was originally in that forest today, or at least in 2015? And it turns out that indeed, some of it is stored. 19%, that reddish wedge, is in long-lived wood products. Now, this is over 115 years now. And 16% is in landfills, where it is decaying and slowly emitting carbon dioxide and methane. But 65%, nearly 2/3 of that carbon, is in the atmosphere. And we have to remember there's this huge legacy of carbon dioxide from past logging in our atmosphere that we're going to have to remove. And let me just say something about this burning wood for electricity. This happens to be up in my area, up here in New England. It looks clean because it's not operating. The reason it's not operating is because it only works if it's subsidized, and some of the governments up here have pulled the subsidies, and therefore they're not working. A colleague of mine at MIT, John Sturman, has done a lot of work on the emissions from burning wood. And this is just a graph showing up the left side is, well, the zero line is not burning anything. So that would be the amount of carbon emitted if we use solar energy. And the red line going up is the immediate release of carbon dioxide, which is, by the way, from burning wood is greater than burning coal. And then you can see as trees grow back, the red line goes down, but it takes 98 years before you're back to where you were before when you started 98 years before. And the other point that he and I and others have made is that during all that time, you can see there's more carbon dioxide, the space between the black line and the red line, the black arrow and the red line. And that means that a glacier melts somewhere. And when trees grow back, the glacier doesn't refreeze. That's what we mean by not climate neutral. Or sea level has risen. The sea level doesn't go back down. Any of the changes that take place are irreversible. And finally, let me just say something about the health effects. A few years ago, these 8 organizations, the American Lung Association, Allergy and Asthma Network, American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Environmental Health Association, Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, American Public Health Association, National Association of County and City Health Officials, wrote a letter to Congress where they said, burning biomass creates air pollution that causes a sweeping array of health harms, from asthma attacks to cancer to heart attacks, resulting in emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and premature deaths. As Reverend Leo pointed out, with COVID, this is not what you want, is to have these small particulates aggravating the COVID infection. And it's very clear that one of the reasons that people who are living close to these facilities are having higher death rates, and often that's people of color living in poor communities. This is not something that's just made up. This is very real. Millions of infants and children, older adults, individuals with respiratory or cardiovascular disease or diabetes, and individuals with lower incomes face a higher risk of suffering serious health effects from these pollutants. So this is a statement that was made before COVID. I am sure that they are in the process of writing another statement now in the face of COVID. So we need to push back against these false narratives, and we need to recognize that while no single solution to climate change exists, that the biggest solution we have is the one of protecting our forest. It will do the most, it will do it in the shortest time, and at the least cost. So let's go out and do it. Thank you. Here's just one last thing I wanted to say. What's the greatest good for the greatest number? That's what Gifford Pinchot said when he's the sort of the godfather of the forestry industry in forest, supposedly forest conservation in America. So do we want a forest to be forest reserves for carbon and ecosystem service like preventing flooding, biological diversity? Here are 2 prominent carbon scientists standing in a forest next to a very large white pine tree up here in the Northeast. And in the other picture, we have this is what's happening in our area. Truckload after truckload of these just perfect size logs that are just the right size to become as big as the ones on the left in the coming years are being taken out. So we need to make a choice. So let's let more trees grow. Thank you.